Hi guys, Mr. Davis here. This is the next lesson of section B for your exam paper, which is looking at the schema theory. And before we get onto that, just a quick knowledge recall task based on the work we did recently on the working memory. Got 4 questions there. If you can just make sure that they are answered nice and clearly before you move on, pause the video here and crack on with this, and I'll pick it up again in a minute. Okay, so let's take these one at a time. So the diagram to show the structure of the working memory. So if you remember, this was the model that we looked at. We got the central executive at the top, the 3 slave systems operating in the middle, and then we added on long-term memory at the bottom. As I said before, this image might change ever so slightly depending on which Google slide which bit of research you might look at, but essentially it's the same model. Okay, the working memory model. And that's what it needs to look like. Right, second question. 3 features of long-term memory. So 3 features. One of them is that it lasts a lifetime. So it's got a huge ability to store information and it lasts potentially a lifetime. Stores motor programs. So in the long-term memory, you've got these motor programs which are stored. Now, motor program is an important phrase for which we're going to move on to next. So it's important that you're clear on this. Motor program, as it says here, is a set of movements in the that's stored in the memory that specify components of a skill. So you've got lots of different elements of a technique, subroutines, if you like, and the motor program is essentially kind of the overall picture that's stored in the memory, or in the long-term memory. And the better performer you are, and the more experienced you are, the clearer and more useful that motor program is going to be. So a third and final one is that it sends and receives information to and from the working memory. So if you remember, these traces get sent up to the long-term memory. There's then a kind of comparison process that takes place, and then the long-term memory will send information back to the working memory so it can deal with the current situation. But those are the 3 features you need to be aware of for the long-term memory. Lasts a lifetime, stores motor programs, and it sends and receives information to and from the working memory. First role of the working memory, so the primary role of the working memory is that it picks up relevant information from the environment. That's the first thing it needs to do. Before anything else can happen, you have to use your sensors to pick up this information. And then what's the process called of filtering out the key information? That is selective attention. So you retain the useful and important information and you disregard information that's been picked up that you don't need. So for example, noise or reactions of the crowd, that's not going to help you perform the skill any better. So you disregard that and then you focus on the key things that you might be seeing, hearing, feeling, or sensing through kinesthesis. 4 components. Well, if you've got the diagram right at the start, this should be straightforward. So you've got the central executive, phonological loop, visuospatial sketchpad, and the episodic buffer. And just take a minute, while it's not a question as part of this, just try and revise what each one of them does. So the central executive, what's essentially the role there? So that's the boss that delegates the jobs. It gets the information and decides which one of its subsystems or slave systems it wants to perform the job. Phonological loop, as the name suggests, is to do with auditory information. Visuospatial sketchpad is to do with things that you hear, but also a kind of mapping out process that's useful, like really useful in sport. And then the episodic buffer just kind of brings it all together. It coordinates those different traces that might come from the 2 other slave systems, puts a kind of time frame on it, something a bit more meaningful and organized that can then be sent to the long-term memory for comparison. So that is the working memory. If you've struggled with that, please make sure you just go back over that information. It is important that we've got a good understanding of that as we move forward. If we're good, obviously put in any purple pen corrections that are needed there, go over it again just so it's clear in your mind, and then we'll move on to today's work. So this lesson is to do with something that's called schema theory. And again, it's to do with this kind of cognitive processes and what's going on in the brain during sport. So if you can have that down as your title, the learning objective is to learn how responses can be adjusted to suit different sporting scenarios. And then you've just got a few keywords that I want you to make a note of there, things that we'll be coming back to repeatedly during this lesson. Make sure all of that information is down before we move on. Pause the video and just make sure it's nice and clear. Okay, so schema theory developed by someone called Schmidt. So it's worth noting down the name as well, because that name might pop up in the exam, and obviously it's useful to just be familiar with it so you know when you see it what it is that you need to be talking about. And this is it in the crux. So it's based on the idea that there's not a unique motor program for every adaptation in technique. So it's not like every single minute little change in how you perform a specific skill. There's not a unique motor program for all of them. What instead you have is generalized motor programs that can be adapted. So for instance, when you are playing or when you're shooting in basketball, you haven't got a different motor program for every different position and every different part of the court that you might shoot from, and every different eventuality where you're moving forward, you're moving backwards, you're moving left, you're moving right, defenders in front of you. You haven't got an individual motor program for all of them. What you've got is a more general motor program for the skill that's being performed, and then an ability to adjust it accordingly. That's what schema theory is all about. So it's about forming links with an overall understanding or an overall skill set, if you like, so an organized structure of the technique, and then it's adapted slightly. So, for example, you've got two images here of Roger Federer playing a forehand in tennis. So he's playing the same shot. Now take a look at the images. What's different about them? What's different about the technique that he's using? You could pick out lots of different things. So for instance, the height of the ball, that's different. The position he is on the court, so he's quite near the baseline there. Baseline's a little bit further back here, so he's further forward. This one he's stepping in a little bit more, but both feet are grounded. This one, this foot's up in the air. This one looks like it's kind of coming up at him a little bit more, maybe a different type of spin on the ball. This one is maybe on the way down, so maybe as a slice shot. Still the same shot that he's performing. So his motor program in his head is still going to be based on the performance of a forehand, but obviously for each one he's going to have to adjust it slightly based on the specific situation that he finds himself in. He doesn't have a different motor program completely unique to each one of these shots. He's got the motor program for performing the forehand, and then that is adjusted based on the specific situation he's in. So that's based on the same sport and the same technique, the same skill in that sport. You can also apply schema theory across different sports. So for example, throwing a javelin and then throwing an overarm pass that a goalie might play in football. You think about the techniques for those, they're very, very similar. So side on, weight transfer going forward from back here and then finishing high above the head. So that's a very similar technique. Obviously it's different sports though, but you might have a specific motor program for that action that's then adapted slightly based on the specifics of the sport. So for instance, the grip will obviously be different. Maybe the approach is going to be different. So lots of different things. The point of release might be ever so slightly different. lots of different things. And the point is, it's a general motor program for the performance of throwing over arm, but then it's adjusted based on the specific for the sport and the specific for that particular situation. So what I want you to do is use sporting examples to describe two versions of how schema theory can be applied. One based on the adjustment made within a sport. So for instance, like Roger Federer's tennis forehand, and then try and think of another one where the technique might be adapted slightly from one sport to the other. So if you think about work that we did previously on kind of transfer of learning and positive transfer of learning, think of maybe those examples would be good for when you're thinking of from one sport to the other. Okay, so pause the video here, give yourself 5 or 10 minutes just to make sure that you've got each of those examples detailed down, and it's the specifics of the technique which you need to be clear on. What is it that specifically would need to change based on the slight adaptation in the situation? Okay, pause the video here and crack on with that. Okay. Now, for schema theory to be effective, there's 4 processes that must be used. So we're going to look at them one at a time, but before we do that, I just want to outline the overall model. So make a note of these, please. The first part is called initial conditions. It then moves on to response conditions, sensory consequences, and response outcome. Now, you know that I love a bit of color in my presentations, but this is done for a good reason. That the first 2 are blue, and the second 2 are kind of my purpley pink. So the first 2 can be grouped into a category that's known as recall schema. Recall schema. So that's a part of the process where the movement is initiated, obviously at the very start, and it comes before the action is completed. So it takes place before you've actually performed the skill. So the 2 of these are recall. And that's important that you recognize that, because the questions will be quite specific on that in the exam. And then the second one are called recognition. Recognition schema. They help to control the movement and adjust the movement, and it happens during or immediately following the action. So you've got the first part of it, which is to do with the initiation of the movement, and it comes before any movement takes place. And then the second 2 are known as recognition schema, which are to do with slight adjustments and the control of the movement that happens, and it either takes place during or immediately following the action that's being performed. Just make sure you've got all of that down. You've got a clear understanding of the 2 different groups that schema can be split into. Okay, now we're going to look at each one of these processes a little bit more in detail. So the first one of the recall schema, which is initial conditions. So as I go through this, make sure you're making good notes, and then there's a task to complete at the end of each one. So initial conditions, this refers to, and I've made this as clear as I possibly can, knowledge of the initial conditions. So essentially what's going on in the environment. So knowledge of the initial conditions. So before you can do anything, you need to have an awareness or a knowledge, and that's a crucial in the mark scheme for the exams that I've been looking at. It really drills down that that's an essential phrase that you use, the knowledge of the initial conditions. So that has to be recognized before the schema can be used. Excuse me. So things like, where am I? These are kind of essentially questions that you will ask yourself before anything is done. Where am I? What can I hear? What can I feel? What is happening around me? So you get a sense of the situation, the knowledge of what's going on in the environment. And this is the key one, which is why I've highlighted it again, but any one of them could be important. But essentially that's what this one is sometimes known as, the where am I process. So for example, if you're playing basketball, tennis, your position on the court, your position of your limbs, your arms and your legs prior to the action taking place. If you're just standing there and then the ball comes towards you, what do you have to do? What's the current position of your arms and your legs before you then react and turn and drop the racket and swing? All of those things, before any of that happens, what's the current position? So your position on the court, position of the limbs, and then potentially your position in relation to like other players involved. So if it's tennis, you might be considering where your opponent is, whether they're forward on the court, whether they're left on the baseline, whether they're deep well behind the baseline. So you get an initial picture, you get an idea of what the initial conditions of the environment are before you then move it forward. So what I want you to do is, using a sporting example of your choice, make sure you've got this information noted down, but then to apply it to a sporting example, describe the process of initial conditions, giving specific examples for the questions listed here. So for each of these 4 things, through a specific sporting example, it doesn't matter what sport, football, rugby, tennis, boxing, whatever you want, but give clear examples. So rather than just generalized information, try and apply it to a particular sporting example. Pause the video here while you get on with that, and then we will move on. Okay, so the second part of this, second process, still a recall process, a recall schema, which is to do with response specification. Response specification. So make a note of that as a subheading, and then this key information needs to get noted down as well before you start the task. So this part refers to the knowledge of the movement demands or the response demands to assess what your options are. So you've got a sense of the initial environment. Now you need to know, what can you do about it? What's your potential options here? So things like, what do you need to do? If you see the ball, if you're playing tennis and you see the ball coming to your right, what do you need to do then? You might need to take a step forward. Which foot? You might need to drop the racket. You might need to bring the racket up. You might need to move slightly out of the way if the ball's coming more towards you. You might need to do it quickly. You might have a little bit more time. But what do you need to do? So it's an assessment of your available options. What's expected? What is required? So you don't necessarily need to write all of those down in the exam, but that just gives an overall idea of the kind of questions that your body will ask itself during this part of the process. So the knowledge of the movement demands, or the knowledge of the response demands. What do you need to do? For example, how far away is my teammate? So if you're playing football, you've got the ball in the middle of the pitch, how far away are the people that you might want to pass to? Are there other opponents near them, which means that isn't a good option? Is there someone running clear into space further down the field that you need to consider them as an option? And then kind of you draw out that process slightly by thinking, well, how hard do I need to play that pass if I am going to play to them? What type of pass might be best to use? How quickly should I play that pass? Should I play it straight at them or just out in front of them? What are my options and what do I need to do? So just as with the previous one, using the sporting examples of your choice, describe the processes of response specification. Try and give clear, specific examples for those questions that are listed. They're quite similar on this one, so you could just kind of group it all together. Okay, so pause the video here and carry on with that until you're ready to move on. We then come to sensory consequences. Now, remember, this is now the second part of the process, so this is to do with recognition schema. And the key thing here is the action has now begun. So you've gone through that initial initiation process. You've thought about your options. This now then has 2 key parts that are used to control the movement. So this refers to the use of sensors to help guide the movement. So you're using sensors now to make these minor adjustments potentially during the technique. And this might be familiar, particularly if you've done the GCSE. This idea is it's knowledge of performance. So there's an element of feedback coming here, but it's coming during, potentially whilst you're actually doing it. So it's based on the adaptations for the specific situation. So I know how to do a jump shot in basketball, but now I need to adapt it to the fact that I'm to the left of the basket, to the right of the basket, that I'm slightly further back, that I've got a defender in front of me, someone's moving towards me. So all of these little adjustments, what technical changes do I need to make? Do I need to push off a little bit further or faster to get a little bit more height? Do I need to maybe slide to the left slightly? There's tiny, tiny adjustments. Do you need to have a slightly higher release point to get a bit more of a loop on the shot? Again, use the sensors to make these adjustments. So for example, use touch. So you might need to adjust your grip slightly. If it was if it's a throw-in type event or anything, obviously with basketball, using your hands as well, slight change that you might need to make to your grip, whether that's through passing or dribbling, for instance. You might just roll your hand slightly over the ball a little, just to adjust the movement of the ball. That is part of the sensory consequences. But equally, it's the kinesthesis that's important as well. So do you need to adjust the strength and the speed of the pass? So the first one is just to do with almost the stationary sense of what you might need to adjust in terms of touch. But equally, it's the kinesthesis, so in terms of the movement and the movement of the limbs and sensing what movement needs to happen. You might need to adjust, for instance, the strength of or the speed of the pass. If someone's further away, you obviously put a bit more whiz on it. If they're closer towards you, then you might not need to do that. You might need to take a bit of power away from it, or you might need to adjust the technique slightly in terms of the specific situations. For instance, if you're lots of people around the basket and you're trying to find a pass, what's a good pass to use? It might be something like a bounce pass. So it's a slightly different technique. An adjustment is made based on the situation. So using a sporting example of your choice, describe this process and then give specific examples for the questions that are listed, or just these questions here. So for example, you outline the potential adjustments that are required. What changes might then need to take place? So in the different situations you find yourself in, how might the technique be altered? That's the key thing, and do that through a sporting example. Pause the video here and then we'll pick it up for the last one. So the last one in these processes, response outcome, and then this is the final one to do with recognition schema. So as we said before, the action's now up and running. You've made these slight adjustments. This part of it isn't so much to do with control. This is more to do with the one before. But this one is to do with how the schema and potentially the motor program, which is stored in the long-term memory, can be updated. So essentially here, we're looking at the result, the outcome. You're getting feedback on what has happened and how successful the schema was in adjusting that technique. There's a comparison that takes place. So what was the intended outcome and how close have you managed to get to that with the actual outcome? That's what you're basing your judgment on. For example, did the pass reach its intended target? Did it get there? Did it get to the person that you wanted to pass it to? If it did, then your schema was successful. You've made a successful adjustment to the motor program. That's what schema is all about. If it wasn't, further adjustments might need to be made and potentially changes to the motor program. So it's a constant cycle of learning, which is why more experienced performers are better at this process because they've got a better motor program to base it on. If you're a beginner, you might not have the understanding embedded in your long-term memory to be able to make these sorts of minute and very fine adjustments to the technique. But having said that, even elite performers will still make mistakes. So even though I'm an elite teacher, I still can't spell program. That might be to do with the fact it's quite late and I'm tired. But anyway, the key to this is it's a judgment on the success of the schema. So using a sporting example of your choice, describe the process of response outcome. Give specific examples for the questions that are listed here, including an outline of what happens if the process was successful and what happens if it wasn't successful. So pause the video here, complete this one for the final process, and then there's a couple final slides and questions I want us to look at. So just as a little check-in here, let's have a look at this. So these are points that a coach might use when highlighting a response to a skill. They're not necessarily in order, and what you need to do is put them in the correct order of the 4 different processes. So pause the video here, read them through carefully, write them down in the correct order that you see them, 1 for each part of the schema process. Pause the video and then we'll clarify the correct answers. So you should have at the first stage, the initial conditions is this scanning process here. So you scan the pitch to see who's available. The second part is the response conditions. So you judge the distance, you decide what it is that you need to do. What are your options? So judging the distance needed to make the pass to reach a teammate. Sensory consequences, it's this one. So you apply the correct weight to the pass. So that's the actual, you're performing the action there and making any slight adjustments using your sensors. And then the response outcome is the final part, them actually catching it. So just make sure you've got them down in the right order. Purple pen, any changes you need to make to that. We've got one more like this. And this one is to do with the javelin throw. So again, you've got 4 different stages, not in order. Take a moment to note them down in the order that you think they should come in based on the 4 stages of the process. And the first one here, so the foot placement, the clue is happens before. So before you start running, you need to have an awareness of the environment and the foot placement that's currently taking place. You then come to this one, which is the response conditions. So you look at your options, the assessment of, you're making a decision, the assessment of the number of steps to be taken in the run-up. You then have this, which is the sensory consequences to do with adjustments of the grip. And then finally, the distance, which is the outcome, the response outcome. Okay, so 4 key stages. Now, hopefully you've got those right. Make any adjustments with purple pen that are necessary. Then what I want you to do for 2 more sporting examples, it doesn't have to be long, like none of these ones are long, but just have a clear breakdown for each stage of the schema theory and try and do for 2 different sporting examples. So try and think of different sports than maybe the ones that you've focused on throughout the presentation. 2 more in the correct order, highlighting which part of your process is this one, which one is this one, which one is this one, which one is this one. Okay, so pause the video here, make sure you've got 2 clear examples for that, showing the breakdown of each stage of schema theory. Then we've got one final job to do. Okay, so the final part of this, we'll just run through this nice and quick, is the impact on coaching. So the use of schema theory when coaching. What strategies could coaches use to ensure that this is successful? So bearing in mind, performers may have this general motor program that's been developed or is in the process of being developed. What strategies can coaches use to ensure that schema theory, so these little adjustments and these links and these adaptations can be made to ensure that your technique is then successfully applied in kind of similar sporting situations. Have a think, try and note a few down before we go through them on the list. What could a coach do in terms of their coaching, the way that they train, the information that they provide to the pupils or to the performers? What can they do to make these links more effective? So, a range of things. So the first thing to do is that they vary the practice conditions. So if you just have the same practice set up every single time, that's not going to allow the performers to consider the necessary adaptations that are needed in the game. They're just going to repeat the same thing over and over again. So if you just do the set shot from the free throw line, they might get good at the set shot from the free throw line, but that's not going to then help them when they're in a live situation and they have to do a set shot, but maybe it's not from the free throw line. Maybe it's from one of the corners, maybe it's from further out, maybe it's from closer in. So by varying the practice, that provides them with more experience of different situations. So things like 3v2 practice, so live practices are the best ones. So 3v2, so there's constant thinking and challenge involved. Attack versus defense, so again, it's just a repetition of the skill set being performed, but it's done with minor adjustments all the time because you're having to react to other things that are going on in the game. At a lower level, it could just be that you've got no defenders involved. So you're just trying to make a range of passes moving around each other. No one's trying to get in the way, but you're just adapting the type of pass and the range of pass and the speed of the pass that's being performed. So your brain is always just building up the effectiveness of its motor program because it's going to have a better understanding that it's not just the same thing over and over again. It has to make adjustments. So the other things are they can offer frequent feedback. So if they're constantly talking and telling the performers things, that's going to help embed a higher quality motor program. It's going to ensure that the actions and the motor programs are adjusted. So if they're constantly highlighting situations where these adjustments might be beneficial. So if you learn the chest pass in basketball, then throughout the game, all you do is chest pass. When you get close to the basket and you need to be a little bit more cute and subtle and show a little bit of variety, the chest pass might not be the best pass because you've got lots of people hands out to the side blocking everything. So that's where it might be a bounce pass. And the coach highlighting that, use the bounce pass, use the bounce pass. That's going to help them make that slight adjustment. Essentially, it's still the same technique. You're just pushing it down instead of pushing it straight out in front of you. So it's these tiny changes. So frequent feedback. Highlight the transferable skills. So we said that before. So whether it's that's something simple like from netball to basketball, or something a little bit more varied like a javelin throw to a football overarm throw, or the serve in tennis to the volleyball serve, things like that. If you highlight those things, then it's easily more recognizable for the performer. Offering praise when successful. So if you what's the word I'm looking for? Brain's gone dead. Yeah, you embed those ideas of success. So you reaffirm it and reestablish it that was a good thing to do, and they're more likely to make those decisions a lot quicker and more effectively when it comes to a live game. And this is an important point to note down. As I've said before, cognitive performers might struggle if the motor programs are not created or embedded. So if you're not very good or you're a beginner, you're going to struggle with this overall process. Now, because of that, in terms of impact on coaching, coaches teach it stands to reason, but you teach the fundamentals first. You teach the basics. You teach the core elements of the technique. So then as those techniques are developed and the performer improves, they've got this good foundation to build on. They're not going to fall back into bad habits because they learned it poorly at the start of the process. So making sure that they have that understanding of the motor programs is all about the quality of the motor program. and then the variation of experience. That's what's important. So just going through each of these, using different sporting examples, describe how each of them can be applied to ensure that schema is effectively used. So try and just, in addition to making the notes here, try and apply them to sporting situations across a range of different sports. Okay, once you've done that, that's the end of the presentation, guys. Hopefully you've managed to keep up with all the work this week. Can you send me anything that you've done as soon as it's done, including this? I will update the tracker and let you know how things are moving forward. Just as a checker on this, a series of questions just to make sure you don't have to write the answers down, but in terms of making sure that you've understood this topic, just go through each of these, check back through your notes that, initially with your notes, could you answer these questions? And then moving forward, without referring to your notes, are these questions that you're able to answer confidently? Hopefully you can. Right, good luck, lads, and I shall see you soon. All the best.